Hey everybody, and welcome to today's video lecture. This video lecture will focus on structuring your presentation. But before we get started, I want to ask you a simple question. What happens when your presentation lacks structure? This is what happens. Your presentation falls apart. A presentation without good structure is a non-functional presentation. But even worse, it's a boring presentation. If your presentation lacks strong structure, you are going to be putting your audience to sleep. Okay? So that's why having strong structure is so important. Now, as we dive in, we're going to be talking about four main topics. First, we're going to talk about how you can plan your presentation. Second, we're going to be talking about how you can start off strong. What makes for a good introduction for a presentation. Third, we're going to be talking about building those solid body sections. And finally, we're going to talk about how you can close on a high note, how you can conclude your presentation as effectively as possible. Let's start out by talking about planning your presentation. Now, as you're planning your presentation, I want you to ask and answer three questions. First, I want you to ask, who am I presenting to? Remember, audience analysis is the overriding principle of all communication. And so you always want to be thinking about who your audience is, what they want, and what they need. Next, you want to ask yourself, what do I want to achieve? What is the purpose of this presentation? Am I trying to persuade my audience to adopt a new point of view? Am I trying to motivate action? What is it? Ask yourself and answer that question. And then finally, think about what you want to improve in your presentation, in your delivery. If you want to work on your energy level, then focus on that. If you want to work on the clarity of your delivery, then focus on that. But make sure that you're thinking about what and where you want to improve as a presenter. Okay, next let's talk about how you can craft an effective introduction. An introduction is your first impression with the audience. And as with any first impression, you want to make it as strong and as effective as possible. You also want to set the stage for your presentation. To impress your audience, you want to make your introduction clear, you want to make it smooth, and you want to make it dynamic. To ensure that your introduction is clear, that it's smooth and dynamic, you should focus on including these four elements. First, you want to frame your presentation with a catchy title or hook. Second, you want to identify a problem or a need, maybe even an opportunity that your audience faces. Third, you want to propose a solution to that problem or need. And then finally, you want to preview your main supporting points. You want to give your audience a sense of the larger structure of your presentation. Now, the simplest way to frame your presentation is with a provocative title. Let's say that you're presenting on the need for companies or institutions to adapt in the face of change. In that case, you might use a presentation like adapt or die. Yes, it's dramatic. Yes, it's a little overblown, but it grabs your audience's attention and it nevertheless captures something essential about the purpose, the point of your presentation. But that's not the only way to hook your audience in, to encourage them to engage with your content. You can also build suspense by using an extended hook. And there are many kinds of extended hooks at your disposal. You can use, for instance, a startling statistic. You can use an interesting question. That's going to be something that I will lean heavily on throughout this module. You can use a testimonial. You can use a short story, or you could use a relevant quote. really the sky's the limit here, but the point is that these are all going to be a bit longer, a bit more involved than that provocative, catchy title. Now, once you've framed your presentation with that catchy title or hook, you then want to move on to the other elements of the introduction. Next, you want to identify a problem or a need that your audience faces. And you want to address that topic as directly as possible. Just address it head on. At our company, we have struggled for years with XYZ problem. You can be that direct. Then, of course, you want to pivot to your proposal or your solution. To fix that problem, we should adopt ABC policy. And then finally, you want to preview the larger structure of your presentation. To support this point, I'll be highlighting 3 case studies, for instance, right? That's a good, what we might call mapping statement that lays out the basic structure, the main points of your presentation. Now, those are the basics of a solid presentation introduction, but you've got an optional element at your disposal. And we'll talk about this more in the video lecture on persuasion, but I did want to mention it here. So if you feel like you lack credibility or authority with your audience, you can address your qualifications, your credibility right here in the introduction. You can talk about your education. You can talk about your expertise or experience. You can talk about your job or title or position. Any of those things are totally fair game for this introductory section if you lack that credibility in the eyes of your audience. Next, let's move on to building your body sections. Now, effective body sections typically consist of 3 to 4 main elements. First and most importantly, you've got your main supporting point or takeaway, the idea or theme that you're emphasizing throughout this body section that connects back to your overall solution or proposal. You've then got evidence that supports that main point. Next, you've got content that mitigates reservations, and this is somewhat optional, but I do strongly encourage it. And then finally, you've got transitions, and you're going to be using transitions as you move both from a previous section as well as into a subsequent section. So here's how a typical body section would be organized. You'd begin with a transition from a previous point. Then you would state your main point. You would then provide 2 to 3 pieces of supporting evidence. You would then mitigate reservations, and again, this is optional. Finally, you begin wrapping up this section by restating your takeaway, and then you transition on to the next point. And that's basically how all of your body sections are going to work. Now, let's say a few words about transitions. Effective transitions consist of a variety of elements that you should feel free to mix and match. You can use internal summaries. You can use internal previews. You can use signposting. You can use transitional words. Or you can use combined transitions that combine one or more of these elements. So an internal summary is going to be something like, to review what we discussed. An internal preview is going to be, let's discuss a few points here, something like that. A signpost will be something along the lines of, our first point is XYZ. Transitional words are going to be things like next, consequently, as a result. And then combined transitions will be something like, after discussing X topic, let's turn to Y topic. Okay? Now we've got one more optional element here. You can mitigate reservations within body sections, as we've already discussed, or you can have an entire standalone section devoted to mitigating reservations. All right? So you can choose to either mitigate or not mitigate. And if you do decide to mitigate reservations, you've got options about where exactly you do so, either within each body section or in a standalone section. Now let's talk about concluding your presentation. Think about your conclusion as the first impression, but upside down, right? You're doing most of the same elements here that you did in your introduction. You're just doing them basically in reverse as you close out your presentation. So, to bring your presentation to a smooth and successful close, follow these steps. First, signal your conclusion verbally. In writing classes, you've probably been told to avoid things like "in conclusion," but in an oral presentation, that kind of phrase is much more appropriate because you want to signal to your audience, hey, we're getting towards the end, pay attention, we've got really important content coming up. You want to reiterate your solution. Whatever it is that this presentation is about, remind your audience. You want to summarize your supporting points. All right. Remember in the introduction, you previewed the structure of your overall presentation. Here, you want to reiterate and review those main points. You want to ask the audience to act. Business communication is all about taking action. So make sure you remind your audience what action you want them to take. And then finally, just as you wanted to start memorably, you want to end memorably. And you can use many of the same tactics for a memorable close that you did for a memorable open. You can use a startling statistic. You can use an interesting question. You can use a testimonial, a short story, a relevant quote, or you can return to that title or frame that you used to start the presentation. Now here too, you've got one more optional element. You can include goodwill in your conclusion to help you build relationships with audience members. A lot of times that's just going to be saying something nice and sincere about the people that you're talking about so that they close with a positive opinion of you and you're building those relationships going forward. All right, so to review, to conclude even, we talked about 4 main topics in this presentation. We talked about planning your presentation. We talked about building an effective introduction. We talked about planning and crafting those body sections. And finally, we talked about how to close on a strong, powerful note. And that, my friends, is a wrap. That brings us to the end of today's video lecture. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you for our next video lecture.